I do like that, through connection, and it doesn't have to be a psychedelic experience. It can be sexual, or it can just be an emotional, intimate conversation. You can begin to recreate that sense of tribe.
Hi guys, this podcast explores the importance of our connection, well-being and mental health. To reason with someone is to motivate them to do or accept topics, ideas and issues through discussion and having conversations. This podcast is for those that want to raise their awareness, change their perspective or just have a good time. My vision is to help people find reason to live, to grow and to understand. I do that through this podcast as well as counselling individuals that want to help themselves.
No, he needs to know.
I just think he's gonna talk and it's gonna make a lot of sense.
Hold up. Wait a minute. Something ain't right.
One man, one podcast. 3, 2, 1.
Reason With Me Podcast, episode 12.
It's time!
Welcome back guys. Reason With Me Podcast. This has been such a fun season to pick people's brains and talk about a few guests on the podcast. Today, I am talking to an old friend that I used to work with, and I loved watching him work as a therapist, but also being able to, collaborate in some group therapy with Nick and experience the ability to connect with people in a really awesome and different way to what a lot of people might think. And I think he explains that so well. So I'm super excited to have Nick on the podcast. Nick Rue is a mental health counsellor in private practice. He works in Sydney's Northern Beaches. Nick's worked in the disability sector and he's worked with children in out-of-home care. He spent some time as a group therapist at a psychiatric hospital called South Pacific Private. This focuses on addiction and trauma from eating disorders and mood disorders. Nick has a passion for connecting people and believes we are all products of the systems that we are created in. And in order to get well and improve, we all have to see things from a more systemic viewpoint. Nick is an overall awesome dude and really fun to get along with, and I love talking to him about anything and everything, and I'm hoping that you get a lot out of this podcast today as we start to pick Nick's brain about all things connection, well-being and mental health, with a little bit of a light on the psychedelic drugs and the use of drugs in treatment. I hope you enjoy. All right, Nick, welcome to Reason With Me podcast. How you doing?
I'm doing well, Jackson. Thanks for having me on.
Man, it's a pleasure. It's an absolute pleasure, and I'm glad that you can be here. So let's dive straight on in. I want to know, who the hell are you and what is it that you actually do?
Well, I really struggle with that question, if I'm honest. It's so broad, it's so open. One thing that I've come to realize is that everyone, really complex beings. There's a lot that goes into making us, I could tell you that I'm a counselor, which is true. And you might get an idea of the type of person I am, and you may or may not be right. And in some situations, you might be right. And then in other situations, I might be someone else. I was born here, but I didn't live here most of my life. I was raised in Hong Kong and Holland, Europe and Asia. I lived in China for a bit, did a lot of traveling. So I picked up many pieces of culture and, kind of didn't really feel like I had a home. I'm what's known as a third culture kid. So I grew up in a culture alien to my own, and then came back here as an adult and sort of reintegrated into Australian society. So there's that aspect. And then, there's a philosophical side of me, and, and then there's a wounded side of me, and then there's a funny side of me. And it's the luck of the draw, which one you're going to get.
Well, I hope I get a bit of each one in this podcast and explore all elements of who's in front of me now, which would be exciting.
I hope so too.
So you said you're a counselor, and why don't you tell me a little bit more about that and what that's looking like for you right now?
Well, I used to actually, I don't know if the audience knows this. You'll probably say this in your introduction, but we met at South Pacific Private,
We did.
where I'm a therapist. So I worked there for a couple of years. I did some group psychotherapy there. And now I've branched out on my own. And for the last year or more, I've run a private practice out of DY.
Mm-hmm.
And that's my full-time gig, even though it's not technically full-time, but that's all I do for employment. It's hard to really describe what I do. Essentially my speciality, when I was in the hospital, was addiction and trauma. And I think a lot of that has followed me. So I still see a lot of clients that struggle with particularly trauma.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that's probably, I would say, my speciality or my area of focus.
Mm. Yeah, and that's why you're here. I think I guess knowing you, Nick, I know that a lot of the experience and then just the different way that you approach people with trauma is so, I guess, inspiring, but also hopefully moving into a place that a lot more people can take on. And I think that's that integrative way that you do with clients. So tell me a little bit more about like your style you're telling me about.
Okay. I guess it's a brilliant question. So the style, if you will, or the schools of thought that I draw from, that I find most of my inspiration from, that I consider to be highly effective in the field, some of my heroes, they're more, I would say, interpersonal. So they don't sort of view the therapeutic connection between the therapist and the client as a hierarchy, as like, listen to me, I'm the fucking therapist. I know what I'm doing, and you bad client or you good client, well-behaved, you have to listen to it. It's not like that. It's very anti-authoritarian. It's very much like, it's not necessarily that the client is the expert either, because I don't necessarily agree with that. It's like, otherwise, why are they coming for help? It's more like somehow in the connection, in the relationship itself, there is something that emerges. There's truth. There's sort of an agreement and sort of in the connection that emerges between the therapist and the client. That's sort of where the magic is, where the work is. And of course, I'm very, I want to avoid using jargon here. My partner says I do that a lot and she gets lost. So I definitely don't want to lose your audience, because when we go to uni, we learn a language and we expect that everyone understands that language. And I want to be conscious of that. But I draw a lot from what's known as psychodynamic theory, which essentially for me was very revolutionary. It sort of is the idea that human beings are not isolated individuals, just sort of floating around islands unto themselves. They're actually sort of very complicated amalgamations of the systems and their complex family history and their cultural history and their all kinds of complicated stuff like that. And so if someone's sitting in a room with me, we're going to look at the issue that they present, but we're probably going to do it by looking first at their history, at their past, at their relationships, at all of that stuff, because that's usually for me where the magic is, where the wound, if you will, begins. Does that make sense?
Look, that's essentially a big part of what I got from you when we were colleagues is that view of if a human comes into the room and sits with this label already given to them, you can sit with them and go, that may be the case, but what you make up is so different to every single other person that's ever identified with the same label. And that concept is essentially saying we are beings that are so much more complex than some diagnosis.
Yeah, I love that. So I know that later on you're going to ask me about a book, but I'm going to jump in now and talk about a book because it's sort of is really relevant Are you cool with me disrupting the flow there?
You may get 2 book opportunities, and I'm okay with it. So please use one of your token books now.
Sure. So 2 of my heroes in the field are creators of, once again, I want to avoid the complicated jargon, but a field that is sort of a combination of psychoanalysis and a philosophical school called phenomenology, which is sort of like the study of human experience, right? I don't want to get technical, and I don't even claim to understand or be a smarty pants like that. I like to read smart people and like basically just, hack their stuff. But the 2 guys who created this field called intersubjective psychoanalysis, their names are Robert Stollerow and George Atwood, and they have been writing books for 3 or more decades, basically, just sort of talking about, the stuff, basically what we just said. Yeah. That when you sit in the room with someone, you're not sitting with a label, you're sitting with a person. And the way that you as a therapist interact with the person is going to determine the way in which the person responds. So in this book that they wrote, one of many, it's called Structures of Subjectivity. They refer to a previous book by a colleague that they admire. And he basically makes the case that when you get a group of people that approach someone with so-called borderline personality disorder in the way of, let's say, someone named Brandshaft, just a random name, a brilliant guy in the field, suddenly the pages of Brandshaft's work on borderline patients come alive to you. And then when you approach the same type of client from the perspective of a different genius in the field, suddenly their pages come alive to you. In other words, the way that that you treat the client or the patient is going to be the way in which they respond to you. So the relationship itself is actually what's manifesting. So I guess if, I think because we both worked in a psychiatric sort of hospital, I can use that as an example. If someone with an addiction comes in and I'm chastising them all the time and I'm like, you just gotta, like, you're just a bad person and you just gotta stop doing this, and I become really authoritarian, right? That is most probably going to be mimicking something from their family history, and they're going to respond to me in a way in which both reflects the current relationship with me, but also the past relationship. And I'm basically going to bring out in them a response that's either another authoritarian response where they try to big up me, which I think is fair enough, or a response of sort of obsequiousness or like submitting. And essentially, and that was one of so I know I'm ranting and rambling here, but essentially that's one of the issues that a lot of therapists have with addiction counseling, is that it's authoritarian, and that people who have addictions are no different than anybody else. It's the way in which we treat these people that determines their response. And of course, it's not all on the therapist. It's a 2-way connection. But does that make sense at all?
Absolutely. I mean, you tell me if I'm getting it right. Essentially, we're breaking it down into the fact that you and them essentially are doing a dance, and to be able to do that properly, you've got to learn how to be with each other and learn how to connect with each other and learn how not to step on each other's shoes and all that sort of thing. So it's always about the relationship that you're building between them, rather than the type of treatment that needs to happen. It's purely
right.
We interrelate.
Right. Yeah. I love that. That's a beautiful summary. Exactly right. Yeah.
Nailed it. No, I think that's exactly how I've developed as a therapist myself. That's exactly what I think, and I still get to this day people that go, "What are you doing? Why aren't you doing this type of treatment? Why aren't you doing this modality?" And it's like, because I'm being a human with that person.
I love that.
And that's just it. And there is evidence for relationship-based counseling and that sort of thing, but really, like, this is how I interrelate with you, and this is how we connect, and that's the only way I'm going to start to unravel what's going on for them.
Yeah, that's really beautiful, Jackson. I really like that. Too often, I don't want to rag on capitalism, because where capitalism is helping us have this conversation, but too often relationships become commodified, and I am the salesman and you're the product, or vice versa. And relationship, I believe humans evolved in tribes for connection, and I believe that evolutionary response is still with us, and that it in that programming gets sort of disrupted by certain social systems that are very detrimental. So I really like that. It's really good.
We're individualistic, like we are just very to ourselves now, and we don't have the same tribe community base as we used to. I think evolution, like you said, makes sense, but we are capitalists, we are individualistic now, and that tears apart connection as a whole.
And there's a lot of historical, very complicated reasons that I don't claim to understand as to why that happened, but it absolutely is a reality, and a very detrimental one that I think if we don't turn around by the end of the century, we may not have a future. So that's a happy note to add into the little mix there.
Oh yeah. So you'll have to keep listening if anyone's listening right now, because it will get better. But maybe I'll take a turn, because doing this work, man, like once you get into the core of that work, you are such an important part of that relationship and that thing that you build, and especially with some of the things that they're bringing, the presenting concerns, and then all of the history that come with it. Like that's hectic, man. That's really, really, fatiguing, exhausting. There comes a lot with that. So where do you think you pull your strength from in order to do the work that you do?
Yeah, I'm just sitting with the weight of that question. It's actually really weighing heavily on me. In a good way. I really like that question, Jackson. And the answer, I'm sorry, is complicated again, but I have practices that I do, and I don't do them regularly enough. But one of the things that I do is, if I've just finished with a really, and by the way, I'm not advocating this universally. Not everyone has to do what I do, right? This is my thing, and if it doesn't work for you. But one of the things that I do if I've just finished a session that's particularly heavy is I pretty much just go into my bedroom and I lie down and I just focus on the feeling. Like I don't try and distract myself from it. I don't try and run away from it. I just try to feel it as much as I can. And eventually it does move away. But, that's not I don't always do that. And that's not the only thing I do, but that is a practice that I try to get my clients to do as well. I believe in a transformative power of feeling feelings and learning where they came from. But another thing, and the most important thing for me, is if I really am struggling with something, I have a few people in my life who over years I have tested and refined, and they're people that I can reach out to and be vulnerable with. And I can be like really angry and be like, man, I'm so frustrated with this person. Or I can just be like, a sook and be like, I'm just sad. Like I'm just upset. And they will just hold me. They'll just validate. They'll just hear it. They won't sort of be like, well, chin up, it's not as bad. You're not as bad as the kids in Africa who had their own. They're not going to say anything. They're just going to be like, yeah, you're right. That's shit. And that person shouldn't have done that. Or, I feel you and I love you. And that's what I need. And I think that's what we all kind of need. So yeah, between those things, and, I have a beautiful relationship. My partner's name is Gina, and that gives me a lot of strength. Yeah. It's relationships and feeling for me. That's what's important. Feeling emotions. Yeah.
I think it all comes back to that. If you break it down, it all comes back to those emotions, and if we can't have those emotions, we can't have functional relationships. So that's great. That's really, really, I mean, yeah, it is a loaded question, and I guess that's awesome that you're able to sort of come up with what you said, because it's not a simple answer, and I think it's so different for everybody, and you need a lot of it. You need a lot of resilience to do this sort of work, which it's empowering and inspiring that you do that sort of thing to get by and continue to do that awesome work.
Yeah, I'm not going to pretend that I don't have my like periods of just saying I hate this and I'm burning out, or my periods of just loving it. And I think just like any job, it has its ups and downs, but therapy is a very unique calling. I think you're right about that. Yeah.
Mm. I mean, it's sitting with those emotions, which are good or bad or up and down, and just with that self-compassion, sounds like that's what you implement into that, is
100%.
being okay that you're having those things happen for you.
100%. That's vital. Yeah. Yeah.
So I guess I got you onto the podcast, Nick, because I know you've spoken a couple of times at what would you call
The
it?
Australian Psychedelic Society.
Australian Psychedelic Society, and you've been a part of a panel discussion and discussing different things around those psychedelics. And I definitely want to jump back into that, but maybe I'll let you explain what the hell I'm talking about in a much better definition than I can give.
Yeah, beautiful, man. Thanks. So, yes, through a mutual colleague at South Pacific, Karim, I became acquainted with some of the founders of the Australian Psychedelic Society, and they run various events, and they're very beautiful people and very, they're lovely people, and they, frequently some of their events are documentaries where they'll sort of, people will get a camera crew together and they'll film someone who's like in addiction or massive trauma, or soldiers who've come back from war, and they'll use, instead of using drugs the way we understand it, like using drugs to escape, because, not all drugs are created equally, like everyone uses drugs, whether it's coffee or, a pharmaceutical product, or even if you're sick, you take aspirin. Drugs are not the issue. It's the abuse and the use and abuse of them that is the issue. So psychedelics are a particular type of drug that, I don't think I universally condone. I don't think everyone should do them, but for select groups of people and highly traumatized people for whom, for whatever reason, therapy isn't working, complicated reasons around that. Certain, like, for example, magic mushrooms, which is, the psilocybin is the active psychedelic component in that, has been proven, routinely in scientific studies to be quite beneficial in aiding people with, certain types of PTSD. The same thing with ayahuasca. DMT is, the psychoactive component in that. And, these drugs have been used by indigenous cultures for a while. And those guys have quite a bit of wisdom built into the fabric of their culture, So essentially, I was asked to be on panels to sort of talk about, as an Australian counsellor, my perspective, my view on psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy. And what that might look like is, you might be a war vet and you come back from the Middle East, and, you've come back a different man or woman. And nothing is helping you. You're in agony. Essentially, you and I, Jackson, would understand that as PTSD or trauma, right? But it's so bad that this person doesn't seem to be getting any relief anywhere. And, therapists like you and I, for whatever reason, aren't helping her. So what people in the States are starting to do, under the guise of, scientists and psychiatrists and very well-trained therapists, is these people will come into an environment and they will take substances, and they will have a person sit with them and guide them for however long they need it. Some substances last 6 hours. Some last much longer than that. And in that process, like, there's no predicting how the person's going to respond or what's going to happen, but a lot of people report stark relief and very, shall we say, healing experiences. Now, I don't believe in healing. As a therapist, I prefer to use the word transformation. I don't think trauma exactly heals, and that's a conversation we can talk about some other time if you want. But I definitely think substances can assist in the transformational work of trauma. Does that make any sense?
So when you say transformation, and I imagine it's about taking these psychedelic drugs in a very safe environment with a specialist or, a therapist that they feel that they can, so that they essentially tap into that psychoaffective part of the drug that then allows them to go into the space And when you say transform, it's starting to make a little bit of sense of that and release some stuckness. How's that?
Yeah, I think that's probably one way to encapsulate it. The issue for me is that I believe, once again, that trauma is something that needs to be faced and confronted rather than sort of soothed away. But I don't have a problem with therapists that have different perspectives with me. That's fine. That's the way they work. One of the, I guess, and I just want to say as well that I don't engage in illegal activities with my clients. If they come to me, I will let them know that I don't do illegal things, but that if they ever have an experience and they want integration therapy, then they can come to me to integrate their experience, because it's currently not legal in Australia to do this. And, whether that's right or wrong, that is the law, and, just got to respect that. So, yes, one of the best stories that I heard that really actually convinced me of the benefit of psychedelics. There's plenty of stories of people who have incredible healing and positive experiences, but I'm always a little bit wary of that because it sounds like spiritual bypassing to me a little bit. But one of the best stories I ever heard was a guy who, trigger warnings if your audience needs it, I don't know, but his fiancée recently committed suicide, and he wasn't dealing with it. And he took what's known as a hero's dose of mushrooms or psilocybin, which is about 5 grams. And he had the worst experience of his life. It was terrible. Like he was crying, he was in grief, he was in agony, and all the other people who were with him were trying to help him, and they couldn't. He just had to go through that. And he said later on in an interview that it was the best thing that ever happened to him, because he needed to grieve, he needed to feel the pain of his fiancee's dying. And he did a lot of that work in the space of 6 hours. Now, that's not ideal. That can be, that can be intense and very unpleasant, or it can be beautiful and liberating and healing. There's really very little predicting what you're going to get out of the psychedelic experience. Now, there are people who work at the Australian Psychedelic Society, names I can give you, who know and have a lot more experience, I guess, in that world than I do, but that's what I have gleaned. And of course, there are other stories of people who take it and they've been stuck rigid in their trauma forever, and that gives them a new perspective and liberates them and sets them free to be a little more lucid, a little less rigid, and a little more free. And, there's a whole spectrum of things. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. And it ties into, I guess, the crux of the question that I have is if you were to reason with me and reason with my audience, is why is those psychedelic experiences so important in terms of our connection and our mental health and our overall well-being? We've touched on a few of those things, but specifically with that, maybe what would you respond with that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm sorry to be such a pain in the ass, but I once again think that's complicated. I don't think that these experiences are for everyone. I certainly think that, if you're heavily medicated, you should definitely check with a doctor before you have before you take any drugs like this. And if you have a history of psychosis or bipolar or anything, you want to avoid it unless you've got a very trusted person who you're doing it with. Be safe. Set setting and intention, the people you're with, all that stuff, I cannot stress enough, is super important. So I'm not advocating the use of these.
There's some research definitely prior is
right.
Yeah.
Don't just take it on a night out with the boys in the city, use your mind, use your brain a little bit.
Sure.
But there are instances, people report some people report life-changing experiences for the better, some for the worse. And I don't think it's an essential thing, but I think it can be something that is extremely liberating and beautiful. I have had the worst experiences of my life on psychedelics, and I have had some of the best experiences on psychedelics as well. I grew up in Europe, in Holland. So over there, that stuff is legal. And, I took my fair share of illicit substances when I was a teenager. So, yeah. one of the things I guess that I had noticed when taking these drugs is they can usher you into an awareness of connection and things that you do not know, or you're not consciously aware of most of the time.
Right.
And if you're taking it with someone who you trust and are safe with, you can reach levels of intimacy with that person that are quite beautiful too, that border on what some people might even call, experiences of almost telepathy, like where you're almost reading each other's mind and thoughts and stuff like that, just really interesting experiences. So, like I said, not advocating the use of them. And if you're going to use them, be smart, but they can be horrifying and beautiful. And sometimes the beautiful isn't necessarily good. And sometimes the horrifying isn't necessarily bad.
Look, I think some of the research, and I'm not fully around a lot of it, but just in terms of things like doing some ketamine trials with depression and stuff like that.
Yeah.
We also use ketamine for high emergency impact situations, and it's obviously a dissociative based drug, which means that it's putting you in a place that you don't have to either experience that straight away, or so you can have a different perspective whilst you're on it to then essentially integrate or transform into that sort of thing. And I think that's the way we're starting to do research, is we're starting to get this idea that we don't have anywhere near as much evidence about the brain and how it works, in how we can actually start to understand attachment, core issues and those core beliefs, and then how that unfolds in our everyday life based on our history. I don't think we're anywhere near understanding that in its fullest. And I think that's why I wanted to talk to you about this, because the parts that you explained about unlocking a type of connection that we're not familiar with, or maybe we used to be as evolution when we were much more tribe based. Now it's lost, and a lot of that is giving you access to some of those things, and that's so interesting for me, and so I guess I'm so amazed of where we can go with that, and that's why I want to pick your brain about this, because I think the connection and the experience we can have can be, not for everybody, but sometimes so nourishing and nurturing.
100%. I love you saying that, and I can tell from the way you're talking that you've had experiences with this stuff which have been beneficial to you. Is that right?
There's definitely been a whole world of experience in my life that have been good and then been bad, and some indulgent and some therapeutic. And I think the access to do that in a way that is like you said, setting an intention that I am going to attempt this alternate therapy in order to gain something, is very different to I'm going to get smashed with the boys on a farm or whatever it is. Like, it's the intention, and your intention is to, I want to get more well. Look at any yoga retreat, look at all those alternative therapies where people, intense deep meditation. People are trying to access that stuff because we're searching and longing for some sort of answer to give us liberation.
Yeah, I agree wholeheartedly with that. I think that, to beat a dead horse, so to speak, we are tribal, and a lot of us these days lack tribe. I think there's something very unwell in culture at large, in this global culture that we've created. And, you said earlier that we're only just beginning, to discover stuff about the brain and attachment and all of that, which I agree with. I don't think that we know nearly as much as arrogant scientists and philosophers and etc. I think we do, and I like that. I like that we don't know. I like that we've lost this knowledge, and I don't think that the society is ready to reclaim some of that knowledge. I think we're too militant and dogmatic and controlling. I think that it would be better to keep that knowledge in the hands of some indigenous people in the middle of the Amazon for a while, but I do like that, through connection, and it doesn't have to be a psychedelic experience. It can be sexual, or it can just be an emotional, intimate conversation. You can begin to recreate that sense of tribe,
Mm.
that we all sorely miss.
And I think just the experiences that I've had with you, Nick, when we've been in group together, and what can happen once you break down all those dogmatic and societal thinking and just get to raw humans being with each other, the power of what that can create is incredible. And yeah, that sort of brings back that power that people go, oh my God, I've never experienced this much connection in my life. I'm so overwhelmed with how amazing this is. And then it's like, well, that's the way it's supposed to be, you know?
Yeah, 100%. That's right.
So what would you say that and maybe another example of a really positive or liberating experience that you've heard or done yourself or done with a client that allow them to access that connection and then saw some benefit in their well-being?
Are you talking psychedelic or just any experience at all?
Maybe I'll stick with the psychedelic for now, if you do have one. But I guess I'm more focused on what's that experience been after? What have they found when they've come back to therapy and they keep coming back, that you're then able to do that work with them?
Yeah, at the risk of, not breaching confidentiality, of course, all of that, goes without saying. I have had clients use psychedelics on their own and talk about it being the first time in their life that they were able to process their trauma, that they were able to feel pain, or they felt safe enough to feel, fear, and they felt safe enough to cry. And I find that to be fucking super beneficial. I find that to be great. The issue I have, and I've got this little voice or part of me just niggling at me, always trying to get attention, is that, not everyone is going to have that experience. It's not a universal, and you don't know, it's like that feeling of when you're a kid and you get on a really scary roller coaster and you strap in and the straps come down. Once you're locked in to that thing, you have to ride that roller coaster. And, it's not always a fun roller coaster. Sometimes someone's throwing up in front of you, or you're losing, or you've lost your phone or something like that. Or sometimes it's just the best fun ever because you and all your mates are riding it and you're all laughing and having fun, So yeah, I just want to stress that it's not a universal that everyone will experience this, but I have had clients for whom, for whatever reason, their wiring, their complexity, their makeup, their genetics, all of that combining together combines to make hey, this is the first time that I have ever been able to feel my pain or see my family trauma, cultural trauma, school trauma, whatever, from a different perspective. I find that to be super beneficial.
Absolutely. And I think that's probably the key takeaway, I think, today, Nick, is when we can actually start to understand the benefits of different alternative therapies and different experiences that, like we said at the start, there are a lot of people that are untreatable, as the science and the Western world would say. And we can leave them untreated and never being able to fulfill their, a life worth living. Or, they can start to explore and start to reach out to some of this alternative stuff, like the power of the body in some of these ways. So that psychedelic transformation that could be possible, and then other alternative things like song and dance and yoga, like all these new things are worth discussing in this forum, in this way, because for some people that might work, and for some people that might be the only answer for them.
Yeah, I really love that, Jackson. There is no one size fits all. Let's be relational about this. Ancient cultures have employed all kinds of meditative yoga, all kinds of breathing techniques, our forager ancestors, some of whom are still alive, and I hope that they remain that way. Typically a few times a week we'll do a dancing ritual around a fire where they almost like merge sort of, out of their body into this primordial kind of ooze state. And it's a way to cathartic all of the issues in the tribe, and it's a way to combine, it's a beautiful healing thing. And so, altered states of consciousness have been employed I guess as old as we are. Some anthropologists think 180 something, 350,000 years. Like we go way back. And most of that was tribal, and a lot of our conflict resolution and trauma work, so to speak, wasn't done with a Freudian couch. It was done with altered states of consciousness and a tribe to support you. But I will say this as well. Nomadic hunter-gatherers don't typically exude traumatic PTSD the way we understand it. So that's more a product of civilization than anything else, which is interesting too. So perhaps these things are emerging into our culture as another means to bring back that kind of awareness.
And if that isn't a little dangle of the carrot for me to continue to get you back onto the podcast, Nick, because we could go down so many avenues with so much things, because your brain works in ways that I just adore, and the power comes from it, man. So before we wrap up, let's take a little bit of a turn and wind down, I guess. You mentioned before, Nick, about some of the things that I guess you pull your strength from, and mentioned, how important it is to have those people around you and people that you can just get validation from and just be heard. And I think that's so important. But maybe more internally based with this question is, what do you do for your self-care? Like, what is that non-negotiable thing that's on board for you? And look, it's never going to be just one, but what would you say that is for you? What's non-negotiable?
Yeah, look, it's not just one thing. It's exercise, it's eating right, and it's making enough space. Like I've got to have, I have a partner who I love very much, but I've got to have a night or two to myself where I can do nothing. I sit in front of the TV, I play PlayStation, I listen to podcasts, and that's my chill out time. And I love that. That's not negotiable for me. So, yeah.
Purest answer, very raw, and I love it. Now, I said that I'd give you another book that you can throw at me.
Sure.
You mentioned the structures of subjectivity. Now, what would be a go-to book that's something that's really inspired you, I guess, as a therapist, or something that you think would really inspire other therapists?
Okay. Yeah, I don't know about other therapists, but there's a book.
Not there. Maybe just anything in general that other people might be interested in. Stuff.
I know I'm very difficult. I'm sorry, Jackson.
Oh, this is the point. This is the openness of the question. So you just run with it.
So look, one of the books, like I go through patches where I'm obsessed with authors or books, and recently I've been on obsessed with a guy. He's a Nigerian guy. His name is Bayo Akamaleke. I don't think I said that right. I'm sure I butchered his name.
How am I meant to say his name?
But he's written a book called Letters to My Daughter, These Wilds Beyond Our Fences, Letters to My Daughter on Humanity's Search for Home. And what I love about him is he takes all of the stuff that I'm interested in, like, all the ideas of anthropology and civilization and all of the issues that we're struggling with. And he talks about what deep shit we're in as people, and he doesn't give any clear answers. He actually asks us to look at the questions in different ways, and that I think is a beautiful thing. Yeah.
Awesome. So I'm not even going to try to repeat his name, but you could find that book and the first book on the website
Amazon.com.
Yeah, and I'll put a link to that up there on my website. But Nick, just the last question I have for you is where can people find you? You're probably still half of my clients at this stage because of the work you do sounds so amazing. But where can people find you and where can they go?
Yeah, look, I don't want to steal your clients, Jackson. You can have some of mine. How about that?
Fair enough.
So my website is counselingwithnick.com, and you can find all the information to get in contact. And my email is counselingwithnick@gmail.com. So yeah, you'll find all the information on my website.
And do you still have that nice guided meditation up there?
I do. You just reminded me. I told people I was going to do more, so I should probably get cracking with a few more guided meditations.
Awesome. Well, that's where you can find it on Counseling with Nick, which I'll put up on the website once this podcast episode is up and going. Look, Nick, it was an absolute honor to have you on the podcast, and I'm so keen to pick your brain about a couple of other of the gems that you mentioned before. But yeah, thank you so much for coming on board.
Beautiful, man. Thank you. Love it, and love your work. All right. Be well.
Thanks, man. Do you want to find out more about how therapy can help you kick some goals? Go check out findreasontherapy.com.au or the Find Reason Therapy Instagram page.